On a quiet morning flight from Dallas to Boston, everything seemed peaceful at first. A black woman named Amelia Carter stepped into first class. She dressed simply, her eyes soft and calm, still holding her phone, displaying the clean energy blueprint she'd been designing. No one on that plane knew that. Just a few minutes later, a single slap and one phone call would shake the entire aviation industry. Captain Paul Whitman, a man with thousands of flight hours, probably thought he was keeping order. But in a moment of anger, his hands acted before his mind could. And that's where the question comes in. If you were Amelia humiliated in front of everyone, knowing you'd done nothing wrong, how would you react? Would you scream, "Demand justice," right there on the spot? Or would you quietly pick up your phone and say one sentence that makes the whole world stop and listen? Sometimes, power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from staying calm, even when you're hurt. And in today's story, you'll see how one seemingly small decision flipped the balance of power completely upside down. So buckle up, because this is Pilot Slaps Black Woman on Plane seconds later. She makes one call that changes everything. If you believe that calmness can change fate itself, hit like, share, and subscribe, because this journey of extraordinary grace is about to begin. That morning in Dallas was as gentle as the slow opening of a jazz tune. The first sunlight spilled across the runway, glinting off the windows of the North Sky Airlines jet preparing for takeoff. Passengers moved quietly toward Gate 12, each carrying their own story, their own small worries of everyday life. Among them was Amelia Carter. She walked with calm composure, a black woman in her early 40s, tall, slender, with eyes that were both kind and determined. She carried a dark brown leather briefcase with a small tag that read, "Bright Nova Labs, renewable energy for a brighter world." Amelia wasn't one to draw attention. She wore a thin beige sweater, gray slacks, and neatly polished flats. Everything about her was tidy, yet simple, just enough for people to see she respected herself, without feeling the need to prove who she was. To her, this was just another business trip from Dallas to Boston, where she would present her solar energy project to the city council. She had spent 3 months preparing for that presentation, every number, every chart, every opening line. But what she could never prepare for was what would happen on this very flight. When the flight attendant checked her boarding pass, Amelia nodded politely and smiled. The attendant returned a faint smile, nothing unusual. She stepped onto the jet bridge, feeling the cool burst of air conditioning, carrying the metallic and plastic scent of a freshly serviced plane. The wheels of her carry-on rolled over the floor with a steady rhythm, like soft drums in a song hinting that something was about to happen. In first class, the golden light reflected off pale gray leather seats. A few passengers were already seated, an older man reading a newspaper, a middle-aged couple whispering quietly. And in the first row on the left seat, 2A was Amelia's spot. She placed her briefcase on the tray, checked her email one last time. A message from her assistant popped up as, "Amelia, the meeting with the investors has been moved to Thursday. You can finally breathe now." She smiled faintly. Breathe. Such a light word. But for Amelia, every breath of relief was a small victory against bias. Just as she fastened her seatbelt, a voice spoke up behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure this is your seat?" Amelia turned around. The question came from Linda Morrison, the flight's head attendant. Linda wore a navy blue uniform, hair neatly pinned up, makeup precise, her gaze sharp and cold, as if always ready to catch a mistake. Amelia blinked in brief surprise, then smiled, showing her phone. "Yes, I'm sure. Seat 2A." Linda leaned down, scanning the QR code. Her brow furrowed slightly, then she nodded. "Thank you. We just wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion." The tone wasn't openly rude, but it wasn't friendly either. Something in her voice, in the way her eyes brushed over Amelia, drew an invisible line between doubt and respect. Amelia turned back to her seat, holding her smile. She was used to looks like that. The unspoken question behind them, "What's someone like you doing here?" For a brief moment, a memory flickered 3 years ago, at an investor meeting, when Amelia presented her clean energy project. One gray-haired man had watched her silently, only speaking at the end. "I think it's a good idea, but having a black woman run an energy company, I'm not sure the world's ready for that." That sentence became a scar, a quiet one. Not because of the rejection, but because of how natural the prejudice sounded. From that day on, Amelia learned to smile, to endure with dignity, not submission. The plane trembled slightly as the wheels lifted from the ground. Through the window, Dallas began to shrink, its buildings reduced to quiet blocks of light. Amelia gazed outside, her eyes holding a trace of sadness. The sky was perfectly blue, cloudless, yet inside her, something faint and gray was rising like a thin mist. In seat 2B, right beside her, sat Douglas Grant, a well-known investor. He didn't seem to recognize Amelia, or maybe he chose not to. 2 years ago, he'd rejected her project in under 3 minutes, not for technical reasons, but because he didn't see a cultural fit. How ironic, Amelia thought, that they were seated together again. Perhaps it was coincidence, but somewhere deep down, a quiet voice whispered, "Fate rarely deals coincidences." Linda walked past the front row again, glancing toward Amelia's seat. Her eyes lingered on the leather briefcase resting on the tray. "Ma'am, could you please store your small bag in the overhead compartment? Our policy doesn't allow personal items there during takeoff." Her tone was firm. Amelia looked up, her voice calm. "Of course. I'll put it away as soon as the plane levels off. These are work documents. I just need to review a few lines." Linda paused for a beat, then gave a small nod. But it wasn't a nod of understanding. It was a nod of restraint. Then she walked away, her heels tapping rhythmically against the floor, a sound Amelia somehow knew would return. Amelia closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines blended with the quiet heartbeat of people who didn't yet realize they were stepping into a story much bigger than themselves. Maybe Linda was just doing her job. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. But Amelia knew the most dangerous things are often unintentional, because they don't come from hatred, but from a belief that's been wrong for far too long. She'd met many like that, people who didn't think they were being discriminatory, yet whose tone, eyes, and manner always reminded others of their place. Amelia opened her laptop. On the screen appeared the line, "Energy belongs to everyone." She smiled faintly. One day, she thought, someone will write the same about dignity. Dignity belongs to everyone. The plane leveled off. Outside, the sky was silent, but inside, a small spark had been lit soft, almost invisible, yet powerful enough to change everything about this flight. As Amelia sipped her water, watching the white clouds drift by, she had no idea that in just a few minutes, her calmness would be tested not by turbulence, not by storm, but by the way people look at one another. Sometimes, the biggest stories don't begin with an explosion, but with a glance, a tone of voice, or a question that's been asked one too many times in someone's life. The North Sky Airlines jet had reached cruising altitude. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a milky white glow over first class, as if the sky itself were watching the people below, silent and without judgment. Amelia Carter took a sip of water, her gaze fixed on the window. She was reviewing a few notes for her Boston presentation when the familiar sound of high heels clicked down the aisle again. Linda Morrison returned her face unreadable. She stopped at seat 2A, looking at Amelia with an expression only those who've known prejudice could truly recognize, not hatred, but coldness, doubt, and a hint of condescension. "Ma'am," Linda began, her voice clipped, "it seems there's been a small mix-up in the passenger list. I just need to reconfirm your seat assignment." Amelia looked up, her tone calm and even. "Of course. I already showed you my ticket earlier, seat 2A. "Right." Linda nodded, but didn't lift her eyes from the small device in her hand. "Yes. Well, there were some last-minute adjustments. We just want to make sure everything's correct for our first-class passengers." Her words, taken alone, were perfectly reasonable, but in context they felt like a pin pressing against a thin thread of dignity. Amelia chose not to react. She simply smiled, tilting her head slightly. "I understand. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry." A simple answer, yet behind it lay an ocean of restraint. Because for people like Amelia, being double-checked wasn't rare. It was an invisible ritual of biased society's way of asking, "Are you sure you belong here?" Across the aisle. Douglas Grant, the renowned investor, looked up from his newspaper. He glanced briefly at the scene, then looked away. But for a split second, his lips tightened as if he'd seen this before, but decided silence was safer. He was part of a world that preferred stillness because silence felt easier than confrontation. When Linda finally turned away, her gaze lingered on Amelia's leather briefcase, the one embossed with Bright Nova Labs. "Clean energy company?" she asked, her tone mildly curious but still cool. "Yes," Amelia replied softly. "I'm the founder." Linda gave a short laugh, not cruel, but not kind either. "Oh, that's interesting. I thought you were in fashion, or maybe education." The words floated in the air like a casual joke, but they carried the weight of generations. An offhand remark that echoed the limits society once placed on women like Amelia, where black women rarely fit the image of a CEO, especially in tech or energy. Amelia smiled faintly, offering no reply. She knew every reaction had a price. One wrong look, one raised tone, and she'd instantly become the difficult one. So she chose silence, not out of weakness, but because she knew when to speak and when to let truth speak for itself. The announcement chimed overhead. "Breakfast service will begin shortly." Linda nodded and walked away. Amelia returned to her notes, trying to push away the unease, but a quiet thought surfaced. Why must people always prove they deserve the seat they already paid for? At 30,000 feet. Humans don't just fly through clouds. They fly through layers of bias, some made of power, some made of fear, and the deepest ones made of unconscious belief. In the row behind, Grace Lynn, an Asian-American woman, had witnessed it all. She didn't intervene, but her eyes followed Amelia with quiet empathy. Grace was a retired sociology professor. She had spent decades teaching about implicit bias, the kind of prejudice no one admits to, yet everyone absorbs over time. And as she watched Amelia smile through the sting of that cold exchange, Grace knew this woman wasn't just staying calm, she was protecting her dignity. The plane shook slightly, cutting through thin air. Amelia turned toward the window, watching clouds fold into soft white layers. In her mind, She heard her mother's voice. When people look down on you, let your calmness make them look at themselves. That saying had saved her more than once from her days as the first black woman in her engineering class to being the only woman in corporate boardrooms. She had never chosen to shout. Instead, she let time and results do the talking. Linda came back again, this time with a breakfast tray. Coffee or tea? Ma'am, coffee, please, Amelia replied. Linda poured, her eyes still observing measuring. Business trip? Yes. Presentation at the Boston Council. Oh, that sounds important. A brief pause. Amelia set her cup down, meeting Linda's eyes with quiet steadiness. Every job is important if you do it with heart. Linda said nothing. She nodded, turned, and left. And in that moment, Grace Lynn smiled faintly. She knew that with one gentle sentence, Amelia had restored the balance not loudly, but enough to make someone think. The flight continued in silence. Passengers read, watched movies, dozed off. But somewhere between the blue sky and the quiet hum of the engines, a spark had been lit. Not the flame of conflict, but the flame of awareness. A flame that only needs a small gust of misplaced power to ignite into something larger. Amelia leaned back, exhaling softly. She didn't know that what had just happened, small as it seemed, was the opening chapter of something far greater. A journey where she would not only defend her own dignity, but also the very idea of respect, something that should have been obvious all along. High above the clouds, everything seemed calm, but within people's hearts, quiet winds had already begun to stir. Since that second ticket check, Amelia had been trying to keep her mind busy. She reread her notes on the laptop, rehearsed her speech in silence, and tried not to notice the occasional sideways glance from Linda. But sometimes, you just know when someone's watching you not out of curiosity, but judgment. In the closed space of first class, even the smallest gesture became amplified. She could hear Douglas Grant's laughter across the aisle as he talked on the phone, that confident, resonant tone that carried the ease of someone who believed the world already belonged to him. She recognized that voice instantly. It hadn't changed since the day she'd pitched to him 2 years ago. Same tone, same power, same impatience to actually listen. She smiled faintly to herself. People don't really change, she thought. Only the setting does. Linda appeared again, heels clicking sharply along the aisle. She held a passenger list in one hand, eyes scanning, then stopping, as if rehearsed. Ms. Carter, she began, her voice polite but tense. I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a small request. There's an elderly couple in first class, and the wife isn't feeling well. They'd love to sit closer together. Would you be so kind as to switch seats so they can be near each other? Amelia looked up, calm but firm. My seat is 2A. Correct. I booked and paid for it in advance. Yes, that's right, Linda said quickly. But if you wouldn't mind... She forced a smile. You know it would be a kind gesture. That phrase, a kind gesture, sounded noble. But Linda's tone stripped it of sincerity. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a test, one that implied, if you say no, you're not a good person. Amelia set her laptop down and closed it. Her gaze met Linda's, not angry, just steady. I completely understand the situation, she said slowly, but I have urgent work to prepare for an important meeting. I'm afraid I can't switch today. Linda froze for half a second. She hadn't expected the calm confidence in Amelia's voice. A short silence followed. Then Linda pursed her lips, nodding stiffly, but her eyes were no longer neutral. Very well. I'll let them know you refused. It wasn't just an update, it was a needle wrapped in velvet. Across the aisle. Douglas looked up briefly. He didn't speak, but that slight frown, that half-smile, it said everything you could have been nicer. Amelia turned toward the window. Outside, the sky was impossibly blue. Everything seemed still, while inside her, small waves began to ripple. She wondered, why is equality so often weighed against morality? Why do people see her as unkind for simply keeping what she rightfully paid for, yet ignore the ones who questioned that right in the first place? From behind, Linda's voice carried just loud enough for others to hear. She wouldn't switch. I tried to ask nicely. A few passengers turned to look, just quick glances, but enough to form an invisible wall around Amelia. From the back row, Grace Lynn, the Asian American woman, leaned slightly forward, her eyes warm with silent understanding. Amelia caught her gaze and smiled. It was a small smile, but in the dull white cabin light, it shone like glass, delicate, but unbreakable. Linda came back once more. "Ms. Carter," she said, tone polite yet sharper now. "If you'd like, I can move you to another seat, still first class, but closer to the aisle. It might be more convenient for your work." "Thank you," Amelia replied evenly, "but I'm fine here." Linda's lips tightened. She nodded curtly, turned, and walked off faster this time, shoulders rigid, heels hitting harder, the rhythm of quiet irritation. Douglas leaned slightly toward her and muttered, half joking, "You've managed to confuse them." Amelia smiled thinly. "Maybe they're just not used to being told no. Or maybe," Douglas said softly, "they're not used to hearing it from someone like you." The words hung in the air, calm, yet painfully honest. Amelia didn't respond. Sometimes, silence is the deepest answer. Moments later, as Linda passed again, she let a comment slip casually, but pointed. Sometimes, a small act of kindness shows who really thinks of others. It wasn't directed by name, but everyone knew who she meant. For a moment, the cabin went still. Amelia drew a slow breath. She looked up and spoke quietly, her tone like wind through glass. And sometimes, a small comment shows who truly respects others. The air froze. Linda stopped for a beat, then walked away. Nearby passengers turned slightly, some surprised, some reflective. Grace Lynn smiled softly. Douglas lowered his newspaper, his expression shifting for the first time. His look toward Amelia wasn't one of judgment, but curiosity. Outside, the sky remained blue, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. A simple exchange had touched something deeper, the fragile line between power and dignity. Amelia hadn't tried to win. She only wanted respect, the same as anyone else. But for Linda, who lived by rules and order, she didn't realize that in that moment, she had lost something far more important, her humanity. The cabin had grown quiet again, but quiet doesn't always mean peace. Some silences carry the echo of pain, the kind no one sees, yet everyone can feel, if they're paying attention. Amelia Carter sat still in seat 2A, eyes gazing through the window. Outside, the sky was perfectly blue, clouds layered like sheets of still water. But inside her, memories rose like ripples, every word, every stare, every moment she'd been judged not for what she did, but for who she was. Linda Morrison had walked past. She didn't say another word, but she left behind a faint chill, the trace of distance, and of contempt carefully wrapped in professional courtesy. Amelia didn't want to dwell on it. She took a slow breath, relaxed her shoulders, and whispered to herself, "Stay calm, Amelia. Not everyone understands your journey, beside her. Douglas Grant turned a page of his newspaper, the soft rustle steady and detached. To him, it was just another passing moment on a flight. But for Amelia, it was a mirror of all those years she'd had to work twice as hard just to be treated as equal. She remembered her first time speaking at the National Energy Conference. When she'd entered the hall, a man at the door had said, "Oh, the catering team's early today coffee's over there." She'd smiled, lifted her name badge, and replied, "I'm the keynote speaker for the Renewable Energy Panel. Would you like some coffee?" The room had gone silent. She told that story later with humor, but only she knew how that night she hadn't slept, because sometimes the wound isn't from the insult itself, but from having to defend your worth in silence. Now, up here in the blue stillness, that memory returned like a cold wind. She clenched her fist, then slowly released it. No, she wouldn't lose her composure. Not this time. She'd learned that lesson early, that even righteous anger could be used to erase your credibility if you were the wrong kind of person. People wouldn't say, "You were treated unfairly." They'd say, "You overreacted." And that was something Amelia never allowed. Linda passed by again, saying nothing. But even in that brief glance, Amelia saw it, that small, sharp flicker of disdain. She knew it wasn't just directed at her. It was a look born of a society that had long asked one silent question. How did she end up here when seeing a black woman in a place of privilege? She didn't blame Linda. Maybe she didn't even realize what she was doing. But Amelia knew unconscious bias was the quiet root of so much pain in the world. A gentle voice came from behind. "Are you all right, Ms. Carter?" It was Grace Lynn, the Asian American woman in row 3. Amelia turned, smiled softly. "Thank you. I'm fine." Grace nodded, her eyes kind. "I saw what happened earlier. The way you stayed calm. That was remarkable. Not everyone can do that." Amelia smiled faintly. Sometimes, staying calm is the only way to survive in a world that constantly doubts you. The words lingered, heavy and honest. Grace was silent for a long moment. In the dim cabin light, she looked at Amelia the way one survivor recognizes another 2 women, 2 different races, carrying the same quiet exhaustion, the fatigue of always having to prove they deserve to be here. Douglas lowered his newspaper, glancing at Amelia. He opened his mouth to say something, but only sighed. It wasn't that he hadn't noticed, it was that he didn't know what to do with what he'd seen. A part of him, the part raised on privilege, told him it was normal. But another part, older and wiser, felt something unsettled. The plane shook lightly. The captain's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're flying through a patch of cold air. Please fasten your seatbelts." Amelia adjusted her strap, her hand brushing the tray table. Her skin was dry, but steady. She noticed a small scratch on her fingernail, a remnant of the long night spent in her lab. She remembered the day Bright Nova Labs landed its first contract. The joy wasn't just about success. It was about finally defeating doubt. Not doubt on her science, but doubt in the woman behind it. And now, she was facing the same kind of doubt again, just higher. Quieter, above the clouds. A battle with no shouting, no heroes, only endurance. Amelia closed her eyes. Behind the dark curtain of her lids, faces appeared, her mother's, who had once been refused service at a diner because of her skin, her father's, who had told her, "It's not what they do to you that defines you. It's how you respond." She could still picture that summer afternoon when a police officer had questioned her father. Voice sharp, cold, and he'd simply smiled in return. Back then, she didn't understand. Now, she did. He hadn't smiled because he was weak. He smiled because he knew that calmness could make others see their own reflection. In the stillness above the earth, Amelia exhaled softly. The wound inside her still existed, but it no longer bled. She'd learned how to turn pain into warmth, not into fire that burns, but into one that sustains. And somewhere between the hum of the engines and the whisper of wind outside, she realized she wasn't alone. There were millions like her people who chose silence, not out of fear, but because they knew anger would only invite punishment for the victim. Linda walked past once more. Their eyes met briefly. Amelia smiled a gentle, quiet smile. Not a truce, not a statement, just a silent message. You don't get to define me by how you see me. And in that instant, her calm became power. A strength without sound. A strength that needed no proof. A strength that, somewhere deep down, made Linda feel small. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in resistance, but in serenity amid the storm. Amelia Carter understood that better than anyone, because she'd been underestimated, doubted, and shut out of rooms she deserved to stand in. And today, sitting in seat 2A, she was still fighting with the quiet, noble strength of grace itself, high above the clouds, in the quiet of first class. Amelia Carter thought she had finally found calm. But sometimes, calm doesn't make people stop. It only makes them test you again to see where your limits truly lie. Linda Morrison returned, her high heels clicking sharply against the aisle floor short, quick, precise, like a gavel striking in an invisible courtroom. She stopped at seat 2A where Amelia sat silently, her gaze still fixed on the window. Carter, Linda began, her tone polite on the surface, but tight underneath politeness wrapped around pressure. I just received another request from the back cabin. That elderly couple, the wife actually has a heart condition and needs a more comfortable seat. Would you mind switching? I promise you'll still remain in first class. Amelia looked up, her eyes calm as still water. Ms. Morrison, she said slowly, I paid for this seat. I do sympathize with that passenger, but perhaps the airline should have arranged that earlier, instead of asking others to give up theirs. Linda gave a thin smile, one that cut more than it soothed. Sometimes, showing a little grace is a sign of kindness. Ms. Carter, not everything in life should be measured in money. Her words were soft, but they sliced through the air like a knife. Subtly, Linda had belittled her, implying selfishness that kindness was something Amelia lacked. Amelia inhaled deeply, then replied, You're right, but kindness doesn't mean letting others decide your worth. The cabin fell silent. Douglas Grant, across the aisle, tilted his head. His eyes caught somewhere between curiosity and irritation. Behind them, Grace Lynn gripped her magazine tightly, sensing that something was crossing a line far deeper than a simple seat dispute. Linda stood firm, unwilling to retreat. Miss Carter, she said, voice lower now but harder. I don't want to make this difficult, but if you continue to refuse, I'll have to report this as noncompliance. I have the authority to do that. Amelia met her gaze, unflinching. You can do what you believe is right, she said evenly, and I'll do what I must to protect myself. Her tone wasn't loud, nor defiant, but carried the weight of someone who'd been misunderstood one too many times, and had decided not to stay silent anymore. The air in first class grew thick. Passengers began to notice subtle glances, whispered tones. Amelia didn't care. She reached for her phone, placed it on the tray table, and pressed record. There was no anger in her expression, only calm purpose. Because sometimes the only way to protect truth is to document it. Linda froze. "What are you doing?" Amelia's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Recording our conversation to avoid any misunderstanding later." Linda scoffed, her eyes flashing with restrained anger. "You're not allowed to record on a plane." "Really?" Amelia asked calmly. "Could you show me the policy that forbids it?" Linda fell silent. In that moment, she was the one cornered because Amelia didn't fight with emotion. She fought with reason, and reason is the one thing that makes the powerful uneasy. Douglas sighed, folding his newspaper. "Maybe you should just give up the seat. Ms. Carter," he muttered. "You know, sometimes smart people also need to be flexible." Amelia turned to him with a faint smile. "Flexibility doesn't mean turning a blind eye. Mr. Grant, if I stay silent today, someone else will be told to stay silent tomorrow." Douglas went quiet. Her words hit him not as argument, but as truth. How many times had he seen injustice and done nothing, simply because it didn't touch him? Linda, clearly losing control, pulled out her radio and spoke in low tones to someone in the crew. Amelia didn't move. She didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to stand firm. A part of her wanted to shout, I don't owe anyone my seat." But the deeper part, the one that had learned to protect herself through composure, kept her still. She remembered her father's words. "You don't have to raise your voice to prove you're right. You just have to speak in a way that leaves no room for denial." Linda returned, face stiffer than before. "Ms. Carter, I've informed the captain. If you continue recording, we'll have to treat this as a security issue." Amelia set the phone down, still recording. "Ms. Morrison," she said quietly, "did you just threaten me?" Linda blinked. I'm just stating policy." "No," Amelia interrupted, her tone steady but resonant. "You're threatening me, and I want you to understand every word you say right now is being recorded, not just by my phone, but by every pair of eyes watching us." The cabin froze. Douglas looked down. Grace Lynn placed her magazine aside, and Linda stood motionless, lips pressed tight. In that instant, Amelia wasn't just protecting herself. She was speaking for everyone who'd ever been silenced by rules, order, or protocol, the polite mass of prejudice. Her strength didn't come from authority or title, but from a resilience forged in the quiet furnace of being underestimated. And for the first time, Linda realized the woman she tried to control was the one teaching her what respect truly means. The captain's voice broke through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. The crew will handle this matter shortly." Linda stepped back, struggling to regain composure. Amelia lifted her coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down. Her eyes returned to the sky, calm, but deep as ever. She didn't want to humiliate anyone. She just wanted to remind them that humility doesn't mean bowing your head, and silence doesn't mean surrender. Up there in the sky, between drifting clouds, a black woman was rewriting what it means to be calm. Not submission, but strength. Because sometimes, those most underestimated are the very ones who make entire systems stop with nothing more than a look, a word, or a single recording. Calmness can make some people lose patience, but for others, that same calm can be the deepest awakening they'll ever experience. First class had gone quiet again after the tense exchange. Linda Morrison stepped back, trying to regain her composure, but her stiff shoulders and uneasy eyes told a different story. She wasn't used to being on the weaker side, especially not against someone she once believed was beneath her. Amelia Carter sat still, eyes gazing through the window, where the endless sky mirrored her soul, tranquil on the surface. But beneath it, currents ran deep. Her phone was still recording, its faint glow not meant to intimidate, but to bear witness to the truth. Around the cabin, the other passengers remained silent. No one spoke, yet everyone felt that something fundamental had shifted. An invisible collision, no shouting, no violence, but the air had thickened like the sky before a storm. In seat 3B, Grace Lynn, an Asian American woman in her 60s, tilted her head slightly. She didn't intervene, but her eyes had followed Amelia the entire time. There was no pity in her gaze, only a quiet empathy, the kind that comes from someone who has once been misjudged for something they could never change. Grace belonged to a generation that had endured too many silent waves in society. Her generation had learned to bow their heads to survive, while Amelia's was learning to lift theirs to be seen. And somewhere in between those two worlds, they met in something called dignity amid adversity. Grace remembered her years as a sociology professor in Boston. She used to stand before her students and speak about implicit bias, the unseen prejudice people carry like breath itself. Her students would often ask, "Professor, how do we know when we're being biased?" And she'd reply, "When someone walks into a room who doesn't look like the people you expect, and instead of greeting them, your first thought is, do they belong here now?" Watching Linda Morrison and Amelia Carter, Grace realized that answer had never gone out of date. Across the aisle, Douglas Grant, the silver-haired investor with his gold watch glinting under the cabin lights, sat with arms crossed. He said nothing, but his face betrayed discomfort. Douglas came from a different world, one built on order, privilege, and the quiet belief that everything already has its proper place. And in that world, someone like Amelia Carter was seen as an exception, a convenient symbol for people to pat themselves on the back and say, "See, we're fair." He'd invested in dozens of companies, but when he'd heard about Bright Nova Labs, the clean energy startup Amelia founded, he'd turned it down. "Great technology," he'd said, "but too risky." The truth. It wasn't the tech that made him hesitate. It was the person behind it. Now, sitting in the same cabin as Amelia, Douglas found himself face to face with what he had avoided, the realization that she wasn't just intelligent, she was stronger than he had ever imagined. Not because she spoke loudly, but because she didn't have to. He looked at Linda, her face flushed, eyes darting away, then back at Amelia, who sat upright, unshaken, unyielding, and something inside him shifted. Grace spoke softly, her voice carrying across the still air. "Ms. Carter," she said, "if you need a witness, I can be one. I saw and heard everything." Amelia turned to her, smiling gently. "Thank you," she replied. "I just hope no one ever has to be a witness to something that should never have happened." The words fell like a quiet chord, and the entire cabin seemed to exhale. Linda paused, glancing between Amelia and Grace. Perhaps, for the first time, she felt ashamed, not because she'd been caught, but because she'd been seen by someone older, wiser, not with anger, but with disappointment. Douglas shifted in his seat, then spoke slowly. "Ms. Carter, you're the CEO of Bright Nova Labs, aren't you?" Amelia looked at him, slightly surprised. "Yes, I remember that company, Clean Energy. Right, I think I heard about it once." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you did. You were the one who turned down our pitch." Douglas froze. Her words pierced straight through his pride. But what disarmed him most was that she didn't say it with bitterness. She said it as a simple fact, and sometimes truth weighs heavier than accusation. Grace looked between them, nodding thoughtfully. She murmured, almost to herself, "Life is strange. People can share the same cabin, the same altitude, the same sky, and still not share the same level of awareness." Linda turned away, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart, but her hand trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. Perhaps she realized she'd just been seen by 3 different eyes: the woman she looked down on, the man she assumed would side with her, and a stranger who saw her as a lesson not yet learned. Amelia smiled softly, not because she had won, but because she could finally see truth doing its own work. She didn't need to react fiercely. She only needed to stay whole, because the world is always watching, and sometimes the witness you never expect is already there. Outside the window, sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling across the airplane wing. In first class, 3 people, a black woman, an Asian woman, and a white man sat in silence. 3 races, 3 generations, 3 prejudices sharing one deeply human moment, the moment of facing truth. Grace reached into her bag and opened her small notebook. With slow, deliberate handwriting, she wrote, "Sometimes, justice doesn't come from a courtroom, but from the eyes of those who dare to see." Meanwhile, Douglas sat back, the weight of guilt pressing on him. He finally admitted to himself the real reason he'd turned Bright Nova down. He'd been afraid to trust someone society had told him not to. And now, 30,000 feet above the ground, he was watching her stand tall, not because others believed in her, but because she never stopped believing in herself. Linda straightened her uniform and walked toward the back of the plane. No one said a word, but everyone knew something inside her had begun to change. Maybe not today, maybe not even when they landed, but a seed of awareness had been planted. Silence returned once more, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was like the pause after a powerful symphony, where everyone sits in quiet reflection. And Amelia, hands resting gently on her lap, exhaled. She had no idea she'd just created a moment that would ripple far beyond this flight. She only knew one thing. Sometimes, calmness is the highest form of strength. People often think the biggest storms happen outside the window where dark clouds roll and winds howl. But sometimes, the real storm lives inside us, between 2 seemingly calm glances. After a few quiet minutes, the air in first class shifted again. Attention spread invisible, like static before a thunderstorm. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. This wasn't over. Linda Morrison Face, still trying to look composed, hurried to the back of the cabin and spoke briefly into her radio. Her voice was low, but loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. Passenger in 2A is non-compliant. Signs of obstructing crew. Obstructing crew, just 4 words, but heavy as an accusation. Amelia Carter looked up. Her expression didn't change, but she knew one sentence like that could turn everything against her. Douglas Grant glanced over and exhaled. "She's not going to let this go," Amelia answered softly, like a breeze. "It's all right. I don't run from the truth." Linda returned, her face different now. No more polite pretense, she wore the stern mask of enforcing policy. "Ms. Carter," she said loudly enough for the whole cabin to turn, "I'm required to remind you that recording aboard the aircraft violates security regulations. If you don't stop, I'll file a report and alert the captain." Amelia met her eyes, not fearful, not defiant, just a steady look that made the other person falter. "Miss Morrison," she said, I'm recording to protect myself, not to hurt anyone. If protecting oneself is a violation, perhaps that regulation needs review. A beat of silence. Then Linda's jaw tightened. Her voice turned cold. I'll be reporting you for violating flight regulations. From row 3. Grace Lynn. The Asian American woman stood, her voice gentle but clear. Excuse me. I'm a passenger on this flight, and I witnessed the entire exchange. Ms. Carter has done nothing wrong. She's been sitting quietly and has been repeatedly disturbed. Linda turned, momentarily startled. Grace's words landed one by one, unhurried, not harsh, but carrying the weight of truth. A white woman nearby nodded. I saw the same, she added. I think we should all calm down. Then Douglas Grant, usually silent and cool, spoke up as well. Linda, I've worked in investing for a long time. I'm used to spotting when someone isn't being truthful. And this time, it's not Ms. Carter. The cabin seemed to stop. Linda stepped back half a pace, lips pressed thin. No one was shouting. No one was arguing. There was only a black woman sitting quietly and 3 others standing with her. And in that moment, the balance of power began to move. Amelia didn't add anything more. She looked straight ahead, her voice low and even. I don't want to disrupt this flight. I only want to be treated like every other passenger. No more, no less. Soft words, yet they carried. A murmur rose from the back rows. A middle-aged man said, She's right. We all see what's happening. Linda went rigid. She was losing control of a situation she'd always believed was hers to command. She stepped back, sighed, and spoke into her radio. I need to see the captain. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Paul Whitman stepped out tall, silver-haired, the steady face of someone who'd seen every kind of crisis at altitude. His eyes swept the cabin and settled on Amelia. What's going on here? Linda moved forward, professionalism back in her voice. Captain, this passenger, Ms. Carter, has been recording without permission and is refusing crew instructions. Paul looked to Amelia. She raised her head. Calm, Captain. I'm recording because I feel I'm being treated unfairly. I'm not causing a disturbance or harming anyone. I just want to protect myself after being questioned, threatened, and asked to give up the seat I legally purchased. Paul was silent for a few seconds. He studied her quiet eyes, steady voice, not the voice of anger, the voice of someone holding on to dignity. Grace Lynn stood and spoke clearly. I can testify to that. Everything Ms. Carter said is true. Douglas nodded, adding slowly, She's right, Captain. I've seen it from the start. Paul exhaled and looked at Linda. Ms. Morrison, is that accurate? Linda's eyes dropped. She stumbled over the words. Yes, perhaps I was a bit hasty. Paul nodded slightly, then turned to Amelia. Thank you for staying calm. I'll make sure you're treated fairly for the rest of this flight. We all get tense sometimes, but respect is something we can never afford to lose. The cabin went absolutely still. Amelia nodded and smiled. Thank you, Captain. Paul turned to go, but before heading back to the cockpit, he said softly, just loud enough for Linda to hear, Sometimes the hardest part isn't flying through a storm. It's recognizing when you're the one creating it. Linda lowered her head and said nothing. She stepped back quietly, carrying a quiet shame, the kind that arrives only when a person truly meets their own limits. Amelia settled into her seat, hands resting lightly in her lap. Grace Lynn gave her a warm, kind smile. Douglas, still arms crossed, leaned slightly and said, almost under his breath, Carter, I think I misjudged you. Amelia answered gently. It's all right, Mr. Grant. We can all learn to see differently. Douglas let out a small, rare smile, the smile of a man used to power, who just learned a lesson in humility. The plane slipped through a thick bank of clouds. The light dimmed, then flared bright again. It all happened in minutes, but everyone in that cabin knew they'd witnessed something unusual. Not a fight, not a showdown, a moment of awakening. When power is challenged not by shouting, but by reason. When dignity needs no demand because it shines on its own. Outside, the sky beyond the clouds looked clearer. Amelia closed her eyes, leaned back, and exhaled. She knew this wasn't the ending, but she also knew the storm had passed, and not everyone was the same. Linda had fallen quiet. Douglas was thinking, and she had simply kept her peace. Sometimes, the way you respond when others try to pull you down is exactly what makes them look up. The storm had passed, but its aftershocks remained, not in the skies outside, but in the eyes of those who had just learned a lesson in respect. After Captain Paul Whitman returned to the cockpit, first class on the Dallas-Boston flight fell into a different kind of silence, no longer tense like a wire pulled tight, but heavy with thought. Someone adjusted their seatbelt. Someone flipped a magazine page, but no one was really reading. At the front, Linda Morrison stood with her hands clasped together. From afar, she looked like someone struggling to regain balance after slipping across a sheet of thin ice. She said nothing and didn't dare glance toward seat 2A. Amelia Carter, the black woman in a simple gray sweater, sat still with her hands resting on her knees. Her face didn't show triumph, only a strange serenity. The calm of someone who had walked through a storm without running from it or fighting it. Douglas Grant sat beside her, occasionally stealing a glance. He'd always believed that power, money, and reputation were what made people heard. But today, he had witnessed another kind of power, the kind born of self-control and dignity. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching a light turbulence zone. Please remain seated. That steady voice seemed to release a collective breath from the cabin. Moments later, the plane trembled gently, and white light spilled through the windows, dancing across Amelia's face. Grace Lynn smiled. The storm outside isn't half as fierce as the one inside us. Is it? Amelia tilted her head and smiled softly. You're right. But if we can stay centered through the storm, we don't just survive it. We make it stop. Linda stepped forward, hesitant. Ms. Carter, her voice small, stripped of authority. I want to apologize. I acted too quickly. I thought I understood the situation, but clearly I didn't. The cabin went still. It takes courage to apologize, especially in front of others. Amelia looked at her, not angry, not proud. Thank you, Linda, she said gently. We all have weak moments. What matters is knowing when to stop before we hurt someone further. Linda nodded slightly, eyes glistening. I'll remember that. And for the first time, her voice sounded sincere. Douglas cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Ms. Carter, I don't quite know how to say this, but I think I owe you another apology. Amelia turned toward him slowly. Mr. Grant, I don't think you did anything wrong. No, I did, he admitted, meeting her eyes. I once saw you as an outsider in the clean energy world. I thought people like you belonged lower down. I was wrong not because you won anything today, but because you made me realize true strength isn't in how loud we speak, but in how we hold our dignity when others try to take it away. Amelia smiled faintly. Sometimes People only see others clearly when they're tested. Mr. Grant, I think today all of us were tested a little. Grace Lynn nodded, and maybe we all passed each in our own way. From the galley came the soft hiss of brewing coffee. Linda returned with a new tray of drinks, carefully pouring and setting cups in front of each passenger, starting with Amelia. A small gesture, but everyone noticed the old hierarchy had quietly reversed. Not through force, but through respect restored. Captain Whitman walked by, glancing at the coffee tray and nodding approvingly. He said nothing, but his eyes held understanding. He had flown through countless storms, yet rarely a peaceful flight that made him think this deeply. As the plane began its descent, golden afternoon light streamed through the windows. Clouds broke apart, revealing patches of blue. Amelia looked down at Boston's tiny buildings rising into view, her heart light, but reflective. She knew that what happened today would be retold in airport corridors, on social media, in casual conversations. But what she'd remember most wasn't the moment she was treated unfairly, it was how she responded to it. Because in moments like these, people reveal who they truly are. When the plane touched down, a round of applause broke out. Not loud, not in unison, but enough to make Linda lift her head and smile faintly. Amelia didn't clap. She simply nodded, grateful. Captain Whitman emerged from the cockpit, took the mic, and said softly, "Thank you for flying North Sky. Today, we didn't just pass through turbulence in the air. Maybe we also passed through a different kind of turbulence within ourselves." Silence, then a few quiet chuckles. And Amelia felt it sometimes. It only takes one person saying the right thing to calm an entire world. As passengers disembarked, Linda stood at the exit, greeting each one. When Amelia approached, Linda whispered, "Have a good stay in Boston," Amelia replied. "Thank you, and I hope your next flights are peaceful ones." A simple farewell, but carrying both forgiveness and closure. Douglas followed, stopping beside her at the gate. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'd love to invite you for coffee sometime. Not to talk business, just to hear more about clean energy. I think I'm finally ready to understand, in every sense of the word." Amelia laughed the warmest laugh since the flight began. "I'd be delighted. Mr. Grant." Outside, the cool Boston wind swept across the runway. Amelia descended the steps, small suitcase in hand, her heart at peace. She didn't need praise or validation. She simply knew that today, by choosing wisdom over anger, she had changed a cabin full of people and perhaps herself. Because sometimes power doesn't belong to those with titles. It belongs to those who can stay composed in the face of injustice. And at 30,000 feet that day, Amelia Carter had become the embodiment of that power, the kind that makes even the sky listen. They say a flight only truly ends when its wheels touch the ground. But for Amelia Carter, her journey was just beginning the moment those cabin doors opened. The North Sky Airlines Boeing 737 descended through thick gray clouds. Below, Boston glowed beneath a crimson sunset, a light both warm and foreboding, as if the sky itself knew a new kind of storm was coming. Inside, passengers sat quietly, but the air was different now, heavier, wiser. They had witnessed something that couldn't quite be explained, a moment so real that if told later, few would believe it. Amelia sat in seat 2A, seatbelt fastened, eyes gazing through the small window. The streets, rooftops, and glowing dots below came into focus. She didn't feel triumphant, just still as if the world around her had shifted, while she remained exactly where she was. From beside her, Douglas Grant asked quietly, "Ms. Carter, do Do you think this ends once we land? Amelia smiled faintly. No, Mr. Grant. The real storm often starts after the sky looks calm. The plane's wheels kiss the runway, a brief metallic shriek, then silence. Applause rose, scattered and subdued. Perhaps everyone was thinking about something greater than the flight itself. The cabin door opened. White light spilled in. Linda Morrison stood by the exit, her professionalism back in place, yet her hands trembled ever so slightly. Amelia gathered her things, but before she could move, a voice came from the back of the plane passenger in seat 2A. Please remain on board to speak with airport security. Heads turned. Linda froze, her face pale. She had sent the incident report mid-flight. Now airport security had received it. Even her apology couldn't undo the system's automatic gears. Two uniformed officers stepped in, polite but firm. Ms. Carter, please come with us. We just need to clarify a few details. Amelia nodded calmly. Of course, I'm happy to cooperate. Douglas rose immediately. She's done nothing wrong. I'll be a witness. Grace Lynn followed, her voice unwavering. And I will too. I saw everything. If she stays, I stay. Their solidarity quieted the entire cabin. Linda looked at them, her lips trembling. She wanted to say something, but all that came out was a whisper. No, you don't have to do that. Security escorted Amelia toward the arrival hall. Several passengers pulled out their phones. Recording. No shouting. No chaos, just quiet documentation. But in the age of the internet, just recording is enough to spark a storm. In the security office, a middle-aged officer scanned the report, then looked up at Amelia. Ms. Carter, he said, you've been flagged for non-compliance with flight crew instructions. Do you have anything to say? Amelia's tone remained calm. I only wanted to be treated fairly. Sir, I didn't do anything except sit where I was supposed to. The officer studied her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. I believe you. And luckily, others do too. He gestured toward the glass window. Outside, a small group of passengers stood at the security gate. Grace Lynn, Douglas Grant, and a few others. They were speaking to staff, firm and articulate, making sure the truth was heard. Meanwhile, on social media, the first clips from the flight began to spread. Less than a minute long, but enough to ignite the internet. A black woman being questioned about a first-class seat. A white flight attendant raising her voice. A man stepping in. A captain emerging to remind everyone of respect. That was all it took. The online world did the rest. Site 2A trended within hours. Comment sections flooded. Debates, outrage, empathy, a digital storm in full force. Someone wrote, "She stayed so calm. I don't think I could have done the same." A reporter from the Boston Globe, already at the airport, recognized Amelia, the CEO of Bright Nova Labs, a clean energy startup recently nominated for the Innovation for Humanity Award. He grabbed his camera. As Amelia left security, he approached her. Ms. Carter, he asked, may I ask what you think about what happened today? Amelia paused, her voice quiet but clear. I think everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them. I just chose not to let someone else's anger define my dignity. That simple line, no drama, no bitterness, rippled through the crowd like a bell in fog. A few people began to clap. By nightfall, the video was everywhere: news broadcasts, talk shows, trending reels. Linda Morrison was placed on temporary suspension. North Sky Airlines released a statement. We are reviewing the incident to ensure fairness and respect for all passengers. But the public's attention wasn't on the airline. It was on Amelia. She hadn't sued, hadn't demanded retribution, hadn't spoken harshly. She'd simply stood in her truth, and somehow, that made her an icon. Later that evening, in her small Boston apartment, Amelia sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the glass. She wasn't happy. She wasn't sad. Just quietly tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes after a long journey was worth it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grace Lynn. "We didn't stay silent. Amelia, thank you for showing us how to speak without shouting." Amelia smiled, typing back, "Thank you for seeing me." The storm online raged on. But Amelia had found peace. Because sometimes, what people say about you doesn't matter. What matters is who you become because of it. And somewhere, on another flight, perhaps another person looked at the passenger beside them and for the first time didn't see skin color, but saw a human being. All because they'd heard her story. Storms in the sky always fade. But the storms inside people, when fueled by truth, can become winds strong enough to change a whole society. That night, as headlines about North Sky Flight 218 flooded the internet, Amelia Carter sat quietly in her small Boston apartment. The glow of her laptop screen flickered across her calm face. Titles rolled in one after another. Black woman questioned for sitting in first class. Bright Nova Labs CEO and the power of composure. Passenger 2A, the seat that woke up America. Within hours, the video had surpassed 2 million views. The hashtag #RamerSeat2A swept across the country. People were sharing, arguing, reflecting, and more than that, they began asking, does justice only exist when it's caught on camera? Her phone buzzed nonstop, reporters, networks, advocacy groups all wanting her voice, but Amelia didn't answer. She sat with a cup of tea gone cold, staring into nothingness. The first call came from Grace Lynn. "Amelia." Her voice was soft but steady. "Don't let them make you a victim. Let them see you as proof." Amelia smiled faintly. "I understand, Grace, but there are still things I'm not ready to say." Grace chuckled gently. "Silence can be its own kind of statement. But when you decide to speak, make sure your words stop people in their tracks." 2 days later, Boston Journal, one of the city's most respected outlets, invited Amelia for an interview. She accepted, but with one condition. No headlines. No hero narrative. "I don't want to be a symbol, just a human being." During the broadcast, the host asked the question. Everyone wanted to know, "Carter, how did you remain so calm when faced with such injustice?" Amelia intertwined her fingers, smiling softly. "Maybe, because I knew that if I got angry, they'd see what they expected to see. But if I stayed calm, they'd have to see themselves." The room fell utterly silent. That answer wasn't just for the interviewer. It was for a nation watching itself in the mirror. The next morning, the New York Times ran a front-page op-ed, "Calm is not weakness. It is the highest form of power." The author, Douglas Grant, the same investor who had once underestimated her. Now, he used his own platform to honor her. The piece began with a confession. "I once believed power meant speaking the loudest. Today, I learned sometimes real power is staying silent long enough for others to truly listen." The story of Amelia Carter was no longer just about one flight. It had become a mirror reflecting dignity and intellect in an age where outrage spread faster than reason. From New York to Los Angeles, from university classrooms to airline boardrooms, people began talking about the 2A effect. It wasn't an organized campaign. It was a quiet revolution, one built on conversation instead of confrontation, on dignity instead of division. A week later, Amelia was invited to speak at the Human Dignity in the Workplace Conference in Washington, D.C. When she walked on stage, the audience rose in applause. She didn't wear a designer suit, just a plain white shirt and a silver necklace once belonging to her mother. Her voice was calm, steady, and full of grace. Justice, she began, shouldn't be a privilege for the fortunate. It should be a certainty for everyone. The hall fell silent. She continued, slowly and clearly. I didn't need a video to prove I deserved respect. But maybe this society needed one to see itself. From the front row, Douglas sat beside Grace Lynn, nodding quietly. Grace whispered, "She doesn't just make people listen, she makes them think." In the days that followed, the hashtag #YinashaMaisiTuwe exploded. But it wasn't about Amelia anymore. People began sharing their own stories. A white man who was mistaken for homeless because he helped someone on the street. An Asian woman recalling the suspicion in every boardroom she entered. A black student who wrote, "Because of Amelia, I didn't give up on school today." Across America, people looked inward through the lens of one first-class seat. Meanwhile, Linda Morrison, now suspended from duty, sat alone in her Minnesota apartment. She watched Amelia's speech, eyes blurring with tears. She no longer saw herself as the victim of cancel culture, but as someone who'd been handed a lesson, painful but necessary. She opened her laptop and typed a short message. "I'm sorry, and thank you for not turning your anger into the world's." Amelia didn't reply immediately. She read the message, smiled faintly, and closed her screen. That night, she stepped out onto her balcony, Boston glowing beneath her. Her name was still trending. News anchors were still analyzing her every word. But inside, she felt no glory, only a quiet conviction. A single story, if told with truth and grace, can change the way people treat each other. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions don't start in courtrooms or Congress halls, but in a single seat, where someone chooses wisdom over rage. After Amelia's speech in Washington, the public storm didn't fade, it evolved. Across the United States, people weren't just talking anymore, they were rethinking. Airlines were being called out. Talk shows turned the topic into national debate. And passengers who'd once stayed silent began sharing their own stories of injustice. Amid the noise, North Sky Airlines, the company behind Flight 218, had no choice but to break its silence. On Monday morning, their official statement hit every major news outlet. "We sincerely apologize to Ms. Amelia Carter for her experience on North Sky Flight 218. The actions of our crew did not reflect the values of respect and equality our airline stands for." They called it an unfortunate incident. But Amelia knew better. It wasn't an incident. It was a mirror, showing society a reflection it had long avoided. In Minnesota, Linda Morrison sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the video that had upended her life. Her own face stared back stiff, cold, uttering words she could no longer believe she'd spoken. She closed it, exhaling. Next to her lay the letter of temporary suspension. No one cursed her, no lawsuit, no public humiliation. But what cut deepest was the look in people's eyes, disappointment laced with pity. She wasn't the strict head flight attendant anymore. She had become the face of bias. For days, she barely left her apartment. Then one evening, she watched Amelia's Washington speech. The screen filled with that calm, radiant face, and Amelia's voice echoed clearly. Justice shouldn't need a viral video. It should simply exist. Linda froze. No accusation, no bitterness, no mention of her name, just truth, gentle. yet razor-sharp slicing through the armor she'd built for years. For the first time, she realized the bias she carried wasn't taught, it was absorbed. It lived in reflexes, in the quiet assumptions she'd never questioned. When she'd seen a black woman in first class, she hadn't thought of policy. She'd thought of possibility and doubted it. Linda broke down, not from shame, but from recognition. For the first time, she truly saw herself. Meanwhile, back in Boston, Amelia Carter met with Rachel Adams, a sharp white civil rights attorney known for her corporate bias reform cases. They met in a small cafe near Bright Nova Labs. "Amelia," Rachel said, "you don't have to sue them to win, but we can make them change." Amelia nodded. "I don't want compensation. I want the system to be rebuilt from training to how passengers are seen." Together, they launched the initiative See Beyond the Seat. It wasn't about North Sky alone. It was about the entire airline industry. Rachel's team began gathering data, 10 years' worth of bias reports and discrimination claims from air travel. Amelia led public dialogues, not with anger, but invitation. Her talks weren't lectures about injustice. They were lessons on humanity, how intellect can replace instinct, how dignity can diffuse conflict. Every time she spoke, the room went silent, not like an audience listening, but like a nation reflecting. Douglas Grant, once a man of status and arrogance, became the campaign's main donor. At a press conference, he said, "I used to think power meant controlling others. Now I know real power is learning to control yourself." A month later, North Sky Airlines launched a new training program, Empathy in Altitude. And in a surprising turn, Linda Morrison volunteered to attend the first class. She wasn't brought back to fly. She was brought back to teach. Standing on stage before a group of young trainees, she said that day, "I thought I was following procedure, but sometimes procedure is just the excuse we use to avoid listening to our conscience." Applause erupted. Some wept. In the front row, Amelia watched quiet, proud. She didn't smile out of forgiveness, but out of acknowledgement, because growth itself was a form of redemption. Soon, See Beyond the Seat expanded beyond aviation into banking, education, and tech. Sociologists began calling it the Amelia effect, the moment when calm replaced outrage, and empathy began to reshape power itself. One golden autumn afternoon, Amelia walked along the Charles River. Her phone rang. Rachel again. "Good news," Rachel said. "North Sky just signed the first National Airline Ethics Accord. Congress approved it this morning." Amelia smiled faintly, watching sunlight ripple across the water. "That's good," she said. "But what makes me happiest is knowing Linda came back, not as a flight attendant, but as a better human being. Because sometimes the strongest person isn't the one who wins, but the one who has the courage to change after losing." And somewhere above, as flights continued to cross the sky, the story of Amelia Carter, the woman who chose intellect over anger, was still being told. Not as a tale of conflict, but as a timeless reminder, dignity isn't something we demand. It's something we protect, even when no one else does. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to let the past define the future for either side. After the See Beyond the Seat campaign, Amelia Carter's life settled back into rhythm, or perhaps found a new rhythm, quieter, more deliberate. She still led Bright Nova Labs, still spoke at conferences, but something in her had shifted. The guarded sharpness in her eyes was gone. In its place was a calm that came only from someone who had truly understood people, their flaws, their fears, their potential to grow. One misty winter morning in Boston, Amelia opened her inbox. Her breath caught for a moment at the sender's name, Linda Morrison. The subject line contained only 2 words. Thank you. She opened it slowly. Amelia. I don't know where to begin. These past days, I've lived in a silence of my own making. I've replayed that video again and again, hearing my own voice, seeing my own face, and for the first time, I understood why you didn't get angry. I carried prejudice without realizing it, believing it was just principle. Now I'm learning how to see people again. If you're willing, I'd like to meet, not to justify, but to thank you for responding in a way that made me face myself. Amelia read the last line several times. Not everyone had the courage to write something like that. She smiled softly and typed back just one line. I'm willing too. Linda, let's meet. A week later. They met again, not in an airplane cabin, but in a small cafe overlooking the Charles River. Linda arrived early, hands wrapped around a cappuccino that had gone cold. When Amelia walked in, their eyes met not with tension, but with the quiet understanding of 2 people who had both been changed by the same storm. Linda spoke first, her voice steady but low. I used to think I was fair. I never cursed, never hated anyone, but now I realize even coldness can be a kind of prejudice. Amelia said nothing. She listened, her gaze gentle, patient. Linda continued. After everything, I went through old passenger reports, the ones labeled not a good fit for first class. 80% were people of color. I realized I'd been part of that system. Amelia set her cup down, speaking softly. What you're doing now, looking inward, is harder than apologizing, because apologies are for others. Change is for yourself. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not making me a symbol of failure, but a chance to learn. Amelia smiled faintly. If I had met your anger with mine that day, neither of us would be here now. Months later, Linda officially rejoined North Sky Airlines not as a flight attendant, but as an instructor for the new Empathy in Altitude program, a national training initiative for diversity and inclusion. On her first day in front of a classroom, she said, I once thought being polite meant I couldn't hurt anyone. But it turns out, my gaze did more damage than my words. I learned that from a woman who chose wisdom over anger, and because of that, I changed. In the back row, Amelia sat quietly, listening. No one knew she was there except Linda, who glanced her way from time to time, offering a smile that said thank you without words. After class, the 2 women walked down the airport corridor together. The intercom buzzed with flight announcements. Travelers rushed by with rolling suitcases and distracted eyes. Amelia said softly, It's strange, isn't it? I used to hate airports. To me, they were places where people judged each other in seconds. But now, I see them as places where lives can change, even in the span of a single flight. Linda smiled. Sometimes, she said, the people on the same plane aren't meant to arrive at the same destination, but to learn the same lesson. When Empathy in Altitude hit the news, people stopped talking about Seat 2A as a story of conflict. They talked about it as a story of transformation of connection, not condemnation. No one was the villain. No one was the hero. Just 2 human beings, one who had been hurt, and one who had learned, both walking together toward the light. In a year-end interview, a journalist asked Amelia, Do you ever regret not suing, not fighting harder for justice, in the legal sense? She paused before answering. Justice can make people behave out of fear, she said, but compassion makes them change from within. I chose the longer road because it lasts longer. That afternoon, Amelia returned to her favorite bench by the Charles River, the same spot she'd sat after the flight, when the world had felt too loud. Now, the river shimmered in quiet gold. She wasn't revisiting pain. She was revisiting peace. Her phone buzzed with a new message from North Sky Airlines. Empathy in Altitude is now a national program. Lead instructor Linda Morrison. Amelia set her phone down, gazing at the rippling water, and with a quiet smile, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes, the strongest thing isn't resistance, it's grace. And maybe, just maybe the world will grow softer if somewhere, someone chooses calm over chaos, understanding over judgment, and empathy over everything else. Not every flight ends when we land. Some begin the moment our feet touch the ground." After Linda returned as an instructor for Empathy in Altitude, quiet transformations began spreading through the entire North Sky Airlines network. Training sessions appeared in cities from Boston to Denver to Los Angeles. Flight attendants, ground staff, even executives sat together in plain white rooms listening to Linda tell her story. No preaching, no blame, just a woman who once failed, sharing how another's grace helped her see herself clearly for the first time. And like ripples across still water, those moments began to form a movement. Amelia Carter had long since stepped away from the media spotlight. She turned down interviews, declined features, and quietly returned to her passion developing clean energy solutions at Bright Nova Labs. Then, one early spring morning, she received a call. The voice on the other end belonged to North Sky's CEO, deep, steady, deliberate, Miss Carter. "I have a proposal. We're expanding the Empathy in Altitude program across the entire airline industry, and we'd like you to serve as our honorary advisor." Amelia paused. "Honorary advisor?" She repeated, half smiling. "Yes," he said. "We're calling it the Hale Initiative, named after you, because you started it all, within weeks." The Hale Initiative became a national headline, not as a PR stunt, but as a pledge. Its foundation rested on 3 pillars. 1. Implicit bias awareness, understanding the invisible filters that shape perception. 2. Empathetic communication training, teaching staff how to connect before they react. 3. The Hale Fellowship, scholarships for students of color and first-generation immigrants pursuing careers in aviation and service leadership. Amelia agreed to the role with one condition: "I don't want my name tied to the shame of the past. I want it tied to hope for the future." The launch ceremony in Washington, D.C. was intimate yet powerful. Grace Lynn, Douglas Grant, Rachel Adams, and of course, Linda were all there, standing beneath soft amber lights. Amelia took the stage in a dark blue suit. When asked what it felt like to have a national initiative bear her name, she smiled and said, "A name alone can't change the world. But if it reminds someone that dignity never needs to be proven, then maybe it deserves to be remembered." The audience didn't applaud right away. They simply watched silently as the woman once dismissed on Flight 218 now stood at the heart of an industry's transformation. Within 2 years, the Hale Initiative grew beyond aviation. Universities Yale, Howard, Stanford invited Amelia to speak on how to keep your dignity when you're disrespected. Major corporations, Delta, United, even Amazon adopted Hale modules into their employee training programs. A professor at Columbia called it a soft reform one, not born from law, but from awakening. At the first Hale Fellowship ceremony, Amelia met Jaden Collins, a 22-year-old black engineering student who just received a scholarship to study aerospace design. He approached her nervously. "Ms. Carter," he said, "my mom told me you are the reason I dared to dream this big. She's watched that video 100 times, And every time she does, she says, "Learn to stay calm like her." Amelia smiled, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then learn to use your calm to help others find theirs." That's the real legacy. That night, after everyone left, Amelia stayed in the quiet hall. Golden light fell across a bronze plaque engraved with the words "Hail Initiative" for a sky without prejudice. She touched the cool metal, her reflection rippling softly across it. Memories flickered that flight, those eyes of suspicion, the unspoken weight of judgment. Who could have imagined that from one seat a nation would begin to shift? Linda approached, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You still prefer tea over coffee, right?" she asked with a warm smile. Amelia accepted the cup and nodded. Some things never change. They stood together, watching the plaque gleam. Linda said quietly, "Back then, I only saw you as a passenger. Now I see you as the person who helped me and thousands of others remember how to be human." Amelia smiled, her voice light as the air around them. "No, Linda, I just sat where I belonged. The rest of the world moved on its own." Sometimes, legacies aren't built through grand acts, but through the grace of someone who keeps their self-respect in the moment they're most disrespected. From one seed of doubt came a movement of empathy. And that was the journey of the Hail Initiative. Not everyone gets invited to speak before Congress. And those who do are not always invited because they spoke the loudest, but because the world fell silent to listen. By now, the Hail Initiative had become a symbol, a quiet revolution in corporate ethics and human dignity. Amelia Carter's name appeared everywhere: university lectures, primetime interviews, leadership panels. Yet, what gave her pause wasn't the fame, but a letter, embossed with a crimson seal from the U.S. Senate Committee on Ethics and Social Equality. "Dear Dr. Amelia Carter, we are honored to invite you to address the United States Senate in a special hearing titled Human Dignity in Modern Society and the Role of Business. We request that you share your perspective on the social reform programs you have pioneered." Amelia read it twice, then once more. She understood this invitation wasn't really for her. It was for everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or displaced, and yet chose calm over outrage. The morning of the hearing, a soft rain fell over Washington, D.C. Silver clouds hung low as raindrops slid down the worn marble steps of the Capitol. Amelia walked beside Linda. "Grace Lynn, Douglas Grant, and Rachel Adams," Linda murmured, half teasing, half in awe. "Do you ever think if you'd actually lost your temper that day, maybe you wouldn't be here right now?" Amelia smiled lightly. Maybe. But then again, maybe no one would be sitting in Seat 2A either. The Senate chamber was solemn rows of stern faces under the cold glow of white light. Before her sat senators and advisors. Behind her, rows of reporters and hundreds of citizens, many who remembered Seat 2A vividly. The chairperson spoke first today. "We welcome a woman whose actions made a nation redefine the word dignity." Applause rose, but Amelia only bowed her head slightly, then began in her calm, deliberate voice. "Honorable senators, I'm not here to retell an old story. I'm here to remind us of something we've forgotten, that fairness is not a privilege, and respect is not a reward. When a person is doubted simply for not fitting an image others are comfortable with, that's not just one person's mistake. It's a fracture in our culture." A gray-haired senator leaned forward, voice firm. "Dr. Carter, some argue that you've profited from the past, that your name and the Hail Initiative have become a brand. Do you think you've built a career out of victimhood?" The air tightened. Every camera turned. Dozens of pens froze above notepads. Amelia paused. Then, in a steady tone that carried through the silence, she said, "If dignity can be profitable, then I hope everyone becomes rich." Silence, then a single clap. Another, until the entire chamber rose to its feet. That simple sentence, without rhetoric or rage, rippled through the room like a quiet thunder. The press would later call it the second to a moment, the instant when wisdom once again triumphed over anger. Headlines flooded the nation. If dignity can be profitable. The line that silenced Congress. Amelia Carter, from a disputed seat to a seat of honor. But Amelia didn't read them. She slipped away from the Capitol, walking alone in the drizzle, shoes soaked, hair damp. Grace Lynn caught up, holding out an umbrella. "You know," she said gently, "the world doesn't need more people who talk well. It needs more people who listen like you do." Amelia smiled faintly, "And people who know when to stay quiet." A week later, Congress passed a resolution encouraging all major U.S. corporations to adopt the Hale Standard, a new ethical framework for fairness, empathy, and equality in workplace culture. Shortly after, the Oxford Dictionary added a new term, Hale moment noun. A moment when a person chooses wisdom over anger and through calmness changes the way others see the world. Around the same time, Linda Morrison stood before hundreds of young graduates at the National School of Aviation. "The day I made my mistake, I thought I'd lost everything," she said. "But the woman I once wronged helped me find something I never had before: empathy. So if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: never judge someone by the seat they sit in. Judge them by the way they lift their head when they've been hurt." That evening, Amelia watched the speech on TV. She smiled softly and wrote a single line in her notebook: "Forgiveness doesn't make us weak. It makes us strong enough to rewrite the story." In a world that celebrates outrage, Amelia Carter's calm had become an act of quiet rebellion, a reminder that stillness can shake systems and that grace can outlast anger. And perhaps her greatest legacy wasn't a movement, a speech, or even a law, but the way she made an entire society pause, just long enough to ask, how are we really treating each other? Not every flight takes us to a destination. Some take us closer, to ourselves. After her historic testimony before Congress, Amelia Carter returned to Boston in silence. No television appearances, no interviews, no grand events. When reporters reached out, she simply said, "My story has already been told. The rest is how we choose to live with it." Back at Bright Nova Labs, she resumed her quiet work overseeing the testing of a new generation of solar panels, but every now and then, in the soft light of morning, she'd visit the old wooden bench by the Charles River, the same spot where she once scribbled the first ideas for See Beyond the Seat. The river was calm, the sky so clear it felt like she could touch it, and she smiled, not in triumph, but in the peace of someone who had learned the power of patience. One cool October afternoon, with the scent of fallen leaves in the air, a handwritten letter arrived at Amelia's desk. The ink was smudged slightly in one corner. The sender's name stopped her heart for just a moment. "Linda Morrison, Amelia. I used to think I was experienced, wise. But now I see I was a blind woman, walking in daylight, seeing everything, except the people themselves. You helped me see the world again. And now, when I stand in class teaching young attendants about respect and empathy, I realize what you gave me wasn't forgiveness. It was a second chance to make things right. I'll never forget that day. Thank you not for enduring me, but for choosing not to become me." Amelia folded the letter gently. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, pulled out the same worn leather notebook she had carried since that flight years ago, and wrote a single line. Progress isn't measured by how loud we protest, but by how gently we correct what's right. Months later, at the 5-year anniversary of the Hale Initiative, the halls were lined with photographs. Linda, standing at a podium, smiling as she spoke to a class of trainees. Amelia, shaking hands with a senator after the congressional hearing. And at the center of the gallery, a single photograph of an empty first-class seat. Seat 2A, bathed in sunlight streaming through an airplane window. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Sometimes, one seat can change how we see the world." People paused before it. Some bowed their heads. Some smiled quietly. No one spoke, because they understood this was no longer the story of one woman on a plane. It was the story of everyone who'd ever been misjudged, and still chose to respond with grace. On the 10th anniversary of Bright Nova Labs, Amelia took the stage before her employees. "If someone asked me what the greatest invention I ever created was," she said with a soft smile, "I'd tell them it wasn't a solar panel. It was the moment a person found light within themselves, because that light never goes out." The room erupted in applause. Amelia simply bowed her head, smiling like morning mist. That same year, Linda retired early. In her small apartment overlooking the airport, she still listened to the radio every morning. When the sound of engines roared outside her window, she'd close her eyes and imagine herself flying again, not to serve, but to be free. From a drawer, she took out a letter Amelia had once written her. "Linda, thank you for having the courage to relearn kindness. Keep flying this time, with your heart." She folded it carefully, smiling as sunset poured golden light across her face. On the last day of the year, Amelia boarded a flight to San Francisco for a renewable energy summit. The plane lifted through the clouds, the city below fading into soft light. She gazed out the window at the endless blue horizon, and in that quiet moment, she thought of all the faces Linda, Grace, Douglas, Rachel, and Jaden, each of them a part of the story that began in Seat 2A. She opened her notebook one last time and wrote beneath her earlier line, "We are all flying no one higher than another, only each passing through a different layer of sky." She set down her pen and leaned back. Outside, the sun was setting its reflection dancing across the wing. The plane tilted westward, toward a horizon where light and shadow no longer had a border. And somewhere up there, perhaps, one seat still remains empty, not for the loudest voice, but for the one who listens. Because the world doesn't change through those who shout the most, but through those who stay quiet just long enough to hear what's right beneath the noise. A story that began with one act of doubt and ended with a generation choosing empathy over anger. Would you like me to craft an epilogue, Seat 2A, the next flight, set years later, showing how a new traveler discovers Amelia's story and finds courage from her legacy? Sometimes, we can't choose how the world treats us, but we can always choose how we respond. The story of Amelia Carter isn't just about a case of racial bias on a plane. It's a testament to the quiet strength of wisdom, calm, and the unshakable dignity of being human. When faced with humiliation, Amelia didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She chose stillness, and that stillness made the world stop to listen. Her message remained simple and powerful. Dignity doesn't need to be proven, only preserved. In an age where social media rewards outrage, harsh words, and endless debate. Amelia's story reminds us calm is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. Each of us, wherever we stand, has the power to create change, not through shouting, but through composure, understanding, and kindness. Thank you for joining this journey, a story of prejudice, courage, and compassion. If you believe that kindness can still make the world better, like, share, and subscribe to help us spread more stories that awaken the light in all of us. Because sometimes, just one calm action can change someone else's entire sky.